A great deal of pleasure that I introduce my friend and colleague, Len Traynor.
Thank you, John. Good morning to you all, and thank you very much for being here. After this morning and the weeks to follow, you people will hear some excellent presentations explaining with great detail the many reasons and causes that brought about the American Civil War. One of the great tragedies of the 19th century, and in the minds of many people, one of the great tragedies of the modern age. Between the years of 1861 and 65, the United States was divided in a way it had never been divided before or since by this terrible conflict, which not only divided the country, it divided individual states, cities, towns, communities, and even families. It caused death and destruction on a monumental scale, far above and beyond what was expected or imagined by the people. And it's left a scar on the nation's soul which is still clearly visible even today. During its course, and more importantly since its termination, the Civil War has created tremendous interest throughout the civil world, evidenced by you people being here this morning. And has done this for quite a number of interesting and fascinating reasons. And to name a few, people are surprised to hear it was the greatest war in history between English-speaking people. It was the last of the old-fashioned wars, yet at the same time, it was the first of the new great modern wars. It was a transitional period in warfare. And up until World War I, it was the greatest testing ground in history for weapons, new types of weapons, and new methods of warfare. They just improved their ways of how to kill and maim. But moving away from the military aspects, so many things were developed or pioneered during these 4 years, which today we accept as commonplace, not only in warfare, but in our everyday walk of life, that have maybe slightly or greatly influenced us or affected us in some way. They range from the first battle between ironclad ships, which revolutionised the navies of the world, through to the first use of plaster in Paris for the setting of broken limbs, or the first issuance of instant coffee, and a host of others in between. It was also the time when women took their first major steps along the road to equality. Prior to 1861, women didn't come up against the glass ceiling, it was solid rock. There were very few legal and moral occupations available for women. Excuse me. Then women were viewed as mothers, wives, and homemakers. The commercial world was dominated by men, and as far as I was concerned, women had no place there. But to be fair, the social attitudes at the time and the restricting clothing that women wore stopped them from undertaking many job opportunities that may have been available. But the Civil War changed this dramatically. With the millions of men going into the armed services, job opportunities for women opened up that had been denied them for generations. They became government secretaries and clerks. Some became soldiers and spies. They made uniforms. They worked in factories producing ammunition, armaments, and everything else required by a country at war. But the men folk away, they managed plantations and farms, often working in the fields themselves like common labourers, and they became nurses. This was the first time in history when women were enlisted to serve as nurses, which was against the social attitudes of the time, because a woman looking after a male who was not a close family member practically bordered on heresy as far as the attitudes were concerned. But because there'd been such a scandal about the treatment of wounded during the Crimean War, and the workings of and achievements of Florence Nightingale and the book that she had written about it all, the women of America saw their opportunity. They wanted to make their contribution to the war effort. And bowing to government pressure, the government enlisted women to be nurses. And without any prior training, they were put into these army hospitals and experienced the smells, sounds and sights that they had never experienced in their life before. And not only that, they came up against the resistance from the medical authorities who didn't want the women there. They suffered discrimination and harassment, all for the princely sum of 40 cents a day. But they persevered, and over 4 years they made the nursing profession what we know and appreciate today. And then again, what is it that caused this country to turn upon itself? Well, you'll hear about that in the weeks that follow, but briefly, it was the extreme differences between the northern free industrial states and the slave-owning agricultural states. Two countries, two societies. And these extreme differences were compounded by the hostility, the resentment, the jealousy, and the fear that existed between the two. And these feelings bubbled away for years and were stirred frequently by belligerent politicians, newspaper editors, individuals and organisations that had their own axe to grind. And finally, two events occurred which caused the whole thing to boil over. The country was divided and was at war. But even though they'd been negotiating and agitating for years to happen, when it did happen, they were ill prepared. They thought it was only going to last a couple of weeks. Some of you may remember that classic scene from Gone with the Wind, when Charles Hamilton said to the weeping Scarlet, "Don't cry, honey, the war will be over in a few weeks and I'll be coming back to you." Well, it wasn't over in a few weeks. It took 4 long, terrible years of blood and butchery. When it was all over, a stunned nation looked at the results. Major cities were in ruins. 2 social classes had been completely eliminated, slave owners and the slaves themselves. Southern economy was in ruins, their infrastructure was shattered, and also their landscape was devastated. But there was the financial cost, and the cost in human lives that staggered so many people. It's been estimated that the Civil War cost between $10 and $20 billion, depending on what book you read. To get a present day value, multiply that figure by 25. And the cost didn't end when the last shot was fired. It carried on post-war, the supply of artificial limbs from federal or state governments, looking after veterans in their old age, and the pensions that were supplied to veterans and their widows. The last one was 2009, would you believe? Now, United States government, prior to 1861, their main source of income, 70% of it actually, was from tariffs paid on exporting of cotton. And with that denied them, they had to look elsewhere for their finances. And the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, introduced as a temporary measure the following. For the first time in their history, the United States government issued paper money, the greenback. For the first time, they issued or introduced personal taxation, a goods and services tax. That's familiar. He introduced war bonds. They borrowed money from the banks, financiers, and wealthy individuals as a temporary measure. 160 years later, they are still the main source of finance for the US government, a temporary measure. Just as well it wasn't made permanent. But it was the staggering cost in lives, because the Civil War was fought on 1/3 the land surface of the United States, an area equal to the size of Western Europe and the 7 seas of the world. There were 76 major battles of great immensity, complexity and high casualty rates, and 10,500 lesser ones, equally as deadly. There were 3.5 million participants, men in uniform, and a few hundred women. But it was the cost in lives that shocked the nation and shocked the world. Over 700,000 participants gave up their lives. Some sources say 800,000. Of that number, 60,000 died in prisoner of war camps, mainly through ill treatment and neglect. And the dying never stopped either when the last shot was fired. It continued right after, through suicides, those that died through the wounds they had experienced, and also the illnesses they may have contracted. Comparing the loss on the population then, 700 to 800,000, bring it forward to America's population today, and it would have been equivalent to about 8 million. Could you imagine the shocking effect that would have on the world today if they had an internal struggle that took 8 million lives? And one of the things that saddens me so much about the Civil War was the 1.5 million horses and mules that were killed and died. They had no say on the matter, but they suffered the same as men. Some of the firsts that I mentioned that interest people, we said about nurses. When the war broke out, there was no system in place to collect the wounded, and they often laid on the battlefields for days before they were rescued, if they hadn't died in the process. And an ambulance system was introduced by the medical director of the Army of the Potomac called Jonathan Letterman that was so efficient and so effective it was copied by most of the world's leading civilized nations, and is the same ambulance system that we experience today. The field of medicine has so much to interest you. People say to me, why would you be interested in the Civil War? And I've said, well, you don't have to be interested in the Civil War to be interested in the Civil War. And they said, that's a rather complex answer, explain it. Well, you may not be interested in the war aspects, but some of the things that occurred. See, you may be interested in the nursing profession, the advances in medicine, or you may be a railway buff, and the military railways that were developed during the Civil War was extensive and interesting. You may collect stamps, and the Confederate Postal Service that was introduced and extended was incredible. You may be interested in calligraphy. When you see the beautiful penmanship that was executed in that day and age before typewriters and word processors is breathtaking. And a lot of it was done by women clerks working for government offices. Any questions that might lead on to something else?
That ambulance service, was that one service that served both sides?
A good point. At first, each regiment had 2 ambulances, a capacity of 4 each, insufficient. The ambulances were under control of the regimental colonel, but the horses came under the control of the quartermaster's department. And if they wanted horses, they took them away from the ambulances, so there was no ambulances to pick up and transport the wounded. So Letterman introduced this system which was completely independent of everybody else except the medical director. And as I said, it was so efficient and so effective, it's the system they use today. And also their Surgeon General William Hammond, who was a trailblazer, he introduced general hospitals. They didn't have any hospitals when the war started. They didn't expect it to happen. Not only was all those people gave up their lives, there were nearly 500,000 wounded. There were over 60,000 amputations during the Civil War, because the firepower they used was so devastating. And as an example, if I may, lurking in a pocket here somewhere, apart from my watch, never find any dollar coins when I'm looking for them. Initially, this was the bullet that was used, a round ball. Still pretty devastating. In 1841, this was invented and used extensively during the Civil War. It's called the Minay bullet, that's the slang name. It weighs about an ounce, soft lead, travelling at about 1,000 feet a second, hitting a body, it did devastating damage. And it's quite heavy. Have a look. Any questions? Did I answer yours, Matt?
You did, thank you.
One more question before time runs out. Please, make my visit worthwhile.
Well, what this lady was asking you about the ambulance service. Did the ambulance collect wounded from both sides, or just pick their own?
They did actually.
They did.
Yeah. They were very generous, didn't mind killing each other, but then they'd collect them when they were wounded. If you study the medical aspects, it's very enlightening, but also it's very graphic. It was the first war to be extensively photographed and the first war to get an extensive media coverage. The time is my enemy. Thank you very much for listening.